on track next week. I think that most of you have heard from, raise your hand if you already know that. Well, I think probably most of you then know that. But so I won't take another moment's time. I would like to introduce you to the president of the University of Scranton, Scott Pallars, who will introduce our speaker today.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. And thanks not only for your introduction, but for the amazing work that you've done in putting the Schemel Forum together. It's really terrific. I think it puts the university in the perfect role in terms of building relationships with our community, and that people understand and appreciate what we can be as resources for one another, especially around the life of the mind. And I'm really thrilled to see this develop. I am extremely thrilled today to welcome Jay Parini back to Scranton. As many of you know, the university gave him an honorary doctorate in 2005, and he gave a wonderful, stirring speech to the graduating class that year. So it's a particular privilege for me to welcome you back, Jay, and to say a few words about you. Obviously, people know that Jay is a native son who is grounded in his Scranton experience and yet at the same time full of knowledge and fascination with the wider world. Poet, novelist, biographer, teacher, first book of poems, Anthracite Country, published in 1982. His most recent work, Promised Land, 13 books that shaped America, and in between, a vast array of accomplishments, including his novel, The Last Station, which is going to premiere as a film in Hollywood on December 3rd. Is that correct? That's great. That'll be a very exciting moment for Jay and for all of us who are fans of his. He is the quintessential Renaissance man, and as one who teaches Renaissance literature, I can say that with conviction. He is also a true virtuoso, whose fascination ranges from his Scranton family and neighbors to Leo Tolstoy, W.E. Du Bois, and Walter Benjamin. From the spirit of the coal region to the shaping of America to the geopolitics of the world. He crosses literary boundaries within his medium and intellectual boundaries that reach into other parts of the world and to other people's minds. Recently, Jay's fascination and concern has been with current political and military happenings, especially around 9/11 and the Bush wars in Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He is a man for all seasons and all subjects. The world is his text. He is cosmopolitan, interested in all times and places, but always returning to our own American identity, fascinating in itself. Today, he will speak on the books that shaped America, and we are all eager to hear what they are and why he chose them. Please join me in welcoming back to Scranton our own Jay Parini.
Well, it's good to have a big crowd here. I'm glad you're here. And I'm delighted when I heard, and thank you to my good friend Scott Pallars, Father Pallars, and I have since have had a friendship going now for a few years since I came and gave the graduation speech, and I've stayed in touch with him, and it's been very nice and wonderful for me. It's always moving and fun and everything to come back to Scranton, because as you know, I grew up here in West Side, went to West Side High School. I see my classmate Dom Sadie here, and class of 1966, West Side. And I've, you know, it's not as though I've left Scranton in a sense, because my family is really still here, rooted here, and I come back to Scranton frequently. Been back recently many times, in fact. So I'm often in Scranton and in touch with Scranton. Never lose touch with it, really. But I do zoom around way too much, in fact. My wife was complaining this morning about my ridiculous travel schedule, but that's life. So let me talk about this latest book of mine, Promised Land, 13 Books That Changed America. This all started, and this is part and parcel of the project. 3 years ago, I spent the whole year with my wife and youngest son, Leo, in London. We were living in Hampstead. I was a fellow of the University of London's Institute for Advanced Studies for a year. And early on that year, I didn't know what I was going to be working on, and my wife said, you must come down to, there's a talk tonight by Lord Melvin Bragg, at the church down the street, St. Mary's, which we were attending. So I went down there, and Melvyn Bragg, Lord Melvyn Bragg is a British literary critic, entrepreneur of arts and so forth, television presenter. And he had written a best-selling book called 12 Books That Changed the World. And I was sitting there, and it was pretty boring talk. I was really falling asleep. And I could see the audience was restive, but was amazed this book had sold millions of copies in Britain. And I thought, well, in the margins of my program, I began saying, what would be the 12 books that changed America? I noticed that Bragg's books that changed the world were all English books. That rather amused me. You know, there was not one book that wasn't an English book on there. You know, it was Newton's Principia Mathematica, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, Darwin's Origin of the Species, blah, blah. So the collected works of Shakespeare. He even put the Bible on there in the King James translation. So that's the one non-English book, but it was in the King James translation. So I began to think, okay, what were the books that changed America? And I liked his criteria for the books he wrote about. He said, these are not the greatest books in the world. No, not the greatest books. These are simply books that changed the way people lived their lives, and the way the mind was shifted. And I thought, well, what would be the books, not the great books? Everybody's doing the great books, so to speak, you know, Moby Dick, The Great Gatsby, the great American books. No, I don't want to do that. I said, what were the books that really were pivotal in shaping America's idea of itself? So I began. That night I went back to our apartment in Hampstead, and I was up all night making lists. I'm a big list maker. And I couldn't stop at, you know, putting down all these books. The next morning I emailed all my colleagues in American and British literature and so American studies at Middlebury and elsewhere, good friends, writers. I said, what would be your 12 books that changed America? So I started building this amazing list. So over the next 3 months, I refined this list. I actually came up with a list of 200 books that changed America. And then I finally got it down to about 115 books that changed America. And in fact, there's an appendix, a long appendix to this book, which is called 100 More Books That Changed America. And I have a little mini essay on each one of these. And it killed me to leave out certain books. For instance, I've written a biography of John Steinbeck. And everybody thought, of course, you're going to put Grapes of Wrath on there. But that didn't make the cut. I was trying to think, I don't want to do novels, because not many novels really change. I wanted books that had fundamental change, like the Federalist Papers, things like that really shifted America's concept of itself as a democracy, as a nation, or whatever. So I put very few novels on there. I didn't put The Great Gatsby on there. In fact, you know, once you publish a book like this, you start getting emails and letters from everybody in the universe telling you what you left off. And I somehow left off The Great Gatsby, even from my 100 more books that changed America. So I rather regret that, but that was a big error, because I actually almost put The Great Gatsby on as one of the 12 books. But then, of course, I finally couldn't get it down to 12 books. I had to put a 13th book on there. And I justified that by saying, aha, there were 13 original colonies. So it's a gimmick. I admit it. It's a gimmick, right? Some radio interviewer on NPR was questioning me about this. I said, come on, I'm admitting it's a gimmick. 13 books. I couldn't get it down to any more than that. So what were these books? And let me tell. What I'll do is just tell you what the books were, and I'll talk a little bit about each of the books and why I chose it. But one of the essential things here is that we are a people of the book. You've heard that phrase before. You always hear Jewish people called the people of the book. Well, Americans, generally speaking, I think are people of the book. You know, we come out of a Judeo-Christian tradition, and we're interested in books, believe it or not. Many people don't believe it. Gore Vidal always calls this country the United States of amnesia. And there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, it's a nation that's always busily trying to forget its past. But fortunately, there have always been books that have changed people's minds, that have shifted things and have had momentous impact. And I'll just talk about those books and how they shape the intellectual contours of this country. I thought, well, where could you begin, not begin, but with The Pilgrims. And I had always loved Of Plymouth Plantation by Governor William Bradford, who came over on the Mayflower, and very soon was elected governor of the Plymouth Plantation. and reigned, shall we say, in that position for decades. And all during his time, from 1620, when they landed in Plymouth Rock, until 1647, Bradford was keeping a journal, an amazing journal. It's really beautifully written, and what a story of and I always say it's our first immigrant memoir, because we are a nation of immigrants, right? We came here, but the Indians were here, the Native Americans. And Bradford's book is really about how to get along with the Native Americans. The local Wampanoag tribe, they were very, very feisty. They didn't know who these strangers coming from England were, what they were. I go into that whole thing in my book, talking about separatism in England and how these separatists, these Puritans, had been, first of all, had escaped from England because they were being repressed. And they went to Holland and the continent, and then they made their way on the Mayflower to this strange outcrop, Plymouth Rock, and set up this very fragile colony. Many of them died in the first year, over half of them. It's quite a story of pluckiness. I think in many ways the American character is defined right from the word go with the Pilgrims. The pluckiness, the kind of defiance, the kind of individualism, saying we're not going to be co-opted into the Church of England. The whole, and a very much a religious visionary in running the country, running the colony, I mean. So it's a very interesting story. Oddly enough, the story was lost because Bradford died, the manuscript disappeared. And it disappeared for nearly 300 years. Imagine that long. It was discovered in England. An American tourist was traveling in England in 1850, and he was visiting the Bishop of London at the Bishop of London's summer residence, Fulham Palace on the Thames. And the man said, you know, there's an old American manuscript in our library, which we've got in a box. Would you like to see it? And the guy looked at it and said, wow, this is interesting. He copied it out by hand over the next month, sat there, copied it out by hand, brought it back to the United States. It was then published just as the Civil War got going. It became a huge American success story, a bestseller. Abraham Lincoln read it in 1863 at the height of the Civil War and said, hey, this is one of our founding myths, the story of this cooperation between the original Pilgrim settlers and the Wampanoags, very different kinds of people that managed to get along for decades in a peaceable arrangement. And he said, and so Abraham Lincoln said, let's make it a national holiday. And he declared the first Thanksgiving. Now again, we're the United States of America. I'll bet many of you, if not most of you, didn't even know that it was Abraham Lincoln who started Thanksgiving. It's not an old American holiday. It's a recent one. It only goes back to the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. So one of the things I realized that each of these books is in its own right, has a publishing history, is a story in itself. And one of the things I was trying to do was do the backstories in all these books to show how they worked in American culture and history to effect changes, really. I think that the power and the impact of Plymouth Plantation came during the American Civil War, 3 centuries after the events it's describing. And it's still a classic American story. It's got every aspect of American life here. You've got the immigration memoir aspect, you've got the religious aspect, you've got the social relations of very competing interests aspect. It's got all the kinds of themes. You've got the pluckiness of the American character beginning to be defined by, and there's a great deal of compassion in this man, Bradford. So that's all part of the American character as well. We can trace the American character in its evolution through these 13 books. So I thought, okay, where do I go from here? You're back in the pre-colonial period with Governor William Bradford, the Plymouth Plantation. So, well, let's take it right up to the American, beginning of the American nation, the Revolution. But really, we don't really become a country, in my view, until we have a constitution, right? And the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia was a huge turning point when we were very lucky to have these founding fathers who were all great minds, very well-educated men, brilliant writers, all of them, brilliant writers. And they came together and they argued and argued and argued and argued all summer long at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and it was difficult. I mean, imagine trying to create from whole cloth the United States of America. They came up with the idea of the three branches of government, the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, but the relations among these things, how long presidents should serve, who controls the army, who has the right to declare war, all of these things were huge issues and very much subject to debate. Many, many, many bright, important, interesting people didn't think that we should go ahead with the Constitution. There were the anti-federalists who were endlessly writing articles and books saying, this is a crazy idea. We'll lose all of our freedoms if we go with this federalizing Constitution. They wanted to keep an individual, a loose collection of states. They said, what's wrong with the Articles of Confederation that were already in place? It was working perfectly well. So there were great arguments. But and in fact, there's one little quote I like to read from that. The only thing quote I'll read today is probably this one, because it's worth reading, I think. At the end of the convention, on the last day before the big vote, Benjamin Franklin was a very, very old man in his 80s. He was the kind of eminence grise, the kind of great man of America, right? Everybody, the most respected mind in America was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin said, I want to speak. So everybody was silent, and old Ben Franklin gave his final speech. And here's a quote from it, which I think is quite remarkable. He said, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us. And there is no form of government, but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered. And I believe farther that this is likely to be well administered for a certain course of years, and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. That's rather chilling, isn't it? Thomas Jefferson was over in Paris. He wasn't there at the convention. He heard about this, and he wrote quickly to his friends in Philadelphia and said, he's right. This Constitution is only going to be good for a generation at a time. And there should be a new constitutional convention where everything is on the table for reconsideration every 20 years. So think what think what a fragile thing this was. I get kind of hot under the collar and irate when I hear these Supreme Court justices who talk about being strict constructionist judges, who, trying to imagine what the Founding Fathers had in mind to try and interpret the law. Well, the Founding Fathers had, one thing they had in mind was that what they'd done was very imperfect, very fragile. It's very, very vague, really. And, you get all these Supreme Court judges carrying on like they do. I think it's ridiculous, but that's from my point of view, my 2 cents on the judicial matter, which is worthless, but still. Certainly when you read the conversations from Philadelphia in 1787, you realize how open everything was, some of it's actually quite shocking to read. Well, you learn a lot about it from the people who were there, especially Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay, who wrote the Federalist Papers. What these were over 2 years, a series of articles, 85 of them, published in very prominent newspapers, arguing the case for ratification of this new Constitution. And they're brilliant, these 85 essays. Alexander Hamilton wrote the bulk of them, 50-some, and then another large cluster by Madison, and then John Jay wrote only 5 of them. John Jay was the most experienced of all the judicial minds working. He had actually drafted the New York Constitution, which the original New York Constitution very much served a model for the people in Philadelphia. So it's fascinating. So what I do in my book is I go through the Federalist Papers, pointing out some of the arguments, what were the issues at hand, and trying to let readers, I'm trying to do a lot of the reading for the reader and say, here's really what you get with the Federalist Papers. Here were the big arguments, some of the pros and cons, and it's just fascinating to see how these 85 essays really are shaping the way we live now. So many of the issues, such as, war and declaring war, I was really shocked reading some of it, seeing how often that's been abused over the past years. I was writing this during the time when George Bush was in office, and I was really getting quite hysterical as I as I wrote, realizing what we were up against in that era. And we've really suffered, I think, as a nation from our hubris at times, and for leaders way too willing to take far too much power into their own hands, taking power away from the people, which was the great concern in Philadelphia. How do we keep people in charge of their own lives? Very difficult to do. Well, I'll leave it there. Obviously, the chapter I spent the most time and effort on was on the Federalist Papers, because just trying to comprehend those and read them, and I reread the Constitution, I reread a lot of the history of arguments historians have made for and against the Constitution and all of the issues brought up in the Federalist Papers. That was really one of my most challenging articles, shall we say, to write, because I'm more of a literary guy and hardly a legal scholar, so it was kind of a lot of work to dig into that stuff deeply. I was kind of relieved then to get back to literature, in a sense, with Ben Franklin's autobiography. Ben Franklin's one of my great heroes, He came from nowhere, the son of a soap maker in Boston, ran away from home as a teenager, made his way secretly to Philadelphia, where he famously arrived with 3 loaves of bread in his pocket. Walking down the street, he saw a woman who had 2 hungry children, and he gave them 2 of his 3 loaves. And that was his great generosity. It's a symbolic moment in his autobiography. But, Franklin's life is extraordinary. He was famous publisher of Poor Richard's Almanac. His sayings were famous. He owned a huge newspaper, a publishing house. He was, he was essentially a Rupert Murdoch type, and only a good one. And he owned lots of media outlets. He was a benevolent man, but a brilliant man. I admire Ben Franklin to extravagance. I love reading his writings. Famous writer of aphorisms, right? Poor Richard's sayings, a penny saved is a penny earned, or early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. We all know these sayings of his aphorisms, and his own sense of, I can shape my own life, I can make something of myself, I can reform my clay-like nature, and I can actually shape myself. And I think that he created the American drive to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, to be your own person, to go it alone, Franklin could have waltzed off to the grave singing, I did it my way, He was, but he also, his autobiography is one of his greatest achievements. Also, Franklin invented every damn thing you can think of. Bifocal glasses, the Franklin stove, he invented the urethral catheter. People forget that he did that. He did all these experiments with lightning. He was one of the discoverers of electricity. He did major experimentations with electricity. There's almost nothing that didn't interest Ben Franklin. His mind was capacious. He lived in France during the Revolutionary War and was the U.S. ambassador to France. And when James Madison was sent over there, because the American revolutionaries were getting nervous, was really anything happening over there in Paris? And James Madison went over to visit and found, he wrote back and said, oh my God, Franklin is an old man here. He's like 75 years old, and he's drinking a case of wine every week. He goes to dinner parties every night, and he's bouncing all these young ladies on his knee. Franklin was a rake. He was, but I just figure, when quizzed about this, he said, when in France, do as the French do. He said, I'm trying to persuade them. And the French loved him. They loved to see a man who had, 6 women on his knee and who drank a great deal of wine and was obviously a great party goer. And he lived high off the hog, old Ben Franklin. He was quite a character, but he also managed to forge various treaties, including the Treaty of Peace between Britain and America. He was an amazing man. But one of his greatest accomplishments was his autobiography. which if you haven't read it, I recommend it. Read it. It's great. One of the things he invented in his autobiography was the genre autobiography. Before that, you had memoirs of great men, statesmen or noblemen, or someone like a king might write a memoir, or a general or statesman. But here's the story of an ordinary man writing his own life story and showing it's the story of how he came to be who he is. That's our modern form of autobiography. And we owe all of that to Ben Franklin. To some degree, Franklin invented the American character. The can-do American who pulls himself up by the bootstraps is really an invention of this book, the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Hugely influential. You can't even begin to imagine the influence of a book like that. I went on from there to write about, I'll just skim ahead a little bit. I wrote about Walden. I loved writing about Henry David Thoreau, Walden. This is the beginning of American nature writing. Again, another autobiography. Americans, that's one of their primary forms of writing, is the autobiography. And you read in Walden is a book I've read pretty much every year for the last 40 years. I mean, this is a book that has just become part and parcel of my own life. When I'm in Vermont, which I mostly am, I live out in the country in an old farmhouse, 1850 farmhouse. I walk every afternoon for an hour and a half through the woods near my house. And it's deep, thick woods. There's a path I take, the same one every time. And rarely do I go in those woods that I don't think of Thoreau. He said, you go into the woods to front your essential existence, to see yourself in relationship to the universe, to think about who you are. And the best place to do this is amid the stillness of the trees, he says. It's a beautiful, beautiful book about, and also he formulates many of his ideas, his spiritual ideas, which are connected to not only Judeo-Christian tradition, but he was deeply reading the Hindu scriptures, the Upanishads, the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita. That religious tradition is deeply embedded in his own philosophical and theological makeup. He was interested in Buddhism as well, but mainly the Hindu scriptures, the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita. I love reading that stuff. I was just reading it last week. And it's a beautiful book. And again, the American character willing to go it alone. Interestingly enough, the book, people often fail to notice that the book begins on July 4th. And essentially, Henry David Thoreau is declaring his own Independence Day. I'm going to get free of the material society which is crushing us. I mean, it's the ultimate statement against American materialism. You've got all of these dialogues going on in these American books. Materialism versus spiritual life. Are we being crushed by the things we own? I mean, in many ways, I say that Walden is a rewrite and a parody of Ben Franklin's autobiography. Ben Franklin is always tallying up what he owns and who he is and what he said and what he did. Thoreau is doing this in a very funny way. He said, I took with me 14 nails and 3 pencils, and on and on. And it's kind of a joke. There's a huge wry sense of humor in Henry David Thoreau. Another aspect of each of these books is, I say, not one of these books stands alone. Each of these books represents a climate of opinion. Each of these books has many books that go before it, many books that swirl around it, many books that follow in its wake. And so you couldn't have Walden without having the whole tradition of nature writing that goes before it, spiritual writing. He was reading Emerson's essays. And so I go in and I talk about Emerson's essays as kind of collateral texts to Walden. And so I try to show the climate of books and thinking that each of these books swims in. Each of them is a kind of a nodal point, but all the rivers flow into it and then flow out of it, and it changed. They changed the direction of intellectual thought in very interesting ways. I move on to the little lady who started the Civil War, right? Harriet Beecher Stowe. When in 1862 Lincoln welcomed her to the White House, he was a big, tall man. She was a little lady, and he said, "Aha! You're the little lady who started this great war." And certainly Uncle Tom's Cabin made it possible for the North to go to war in defense of freedom and against slavery. She was a major abolitionist, and she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin for an abolitionist paper. It rapidly became a bestseller. For years on end, they had 8 printing presses running 24 hours a day, trying to keep up with the demand. Uncle Tom's Cabin sold more books in America than any other book in the 19th century except the Bible itself. Only the Bible sold more copies. It was a worldwide phenomenon. People everywhere in the world read Uncle Tom's Cabin. It sold millions and millions and millions of copies. The story itself printed itself in people's brains. And I have to confess, before I decided to write about it, because I knew it was so influential, I had never read it before. It was the one book on my 13 list that I had never read. I always assumed it was a piece of junk. And then I read it. It was like Stephen King on steroids. You know, it's a tremendously powerful narrative and really vivid and makes you see the institution of slavery and how awful it really was. I mean, wow, that was an awful, awful, awful institution, the way these African Americans were treated in the South on these plantations. And you see, you know, and it's entered into our lore, really. We all know who Simon Legree is. He's the representative of the evil man who beats poor Uncle Tom to death at the end of the book. The flight of poor Elizabeth to Canada is, you know, part of our national mythology. Each of these books is a myth-making book, a legend-making book, and these books print in our brains our history, whether we know it or not. I mean, what's amazing to me is that people know these books even when they haven't read them, because they're bedded in their memory. It's part of who they are. I went on from there to one of the two novels I wrote about was the greatest American novel, Huckleberry Finn. There was no way I was going to write this book and not do Huckleberry Finn, right? Ernest Hemingway said, all American literature comes from one book, Huck Finn. And it's a book I've been reading my whole life. Since I first read it in West Side High School in ninth grade, I've been rereading Huckleberry Finn over and over, year after year after year, teaching it to students. I mean, I have it practically memorized. And you know, it's the great story of American freedom. All the themes of American literature are condensed in that book. The orphan boy who pulls himself up, comes up from nowhere, and sets off to become an independent agent in the world, Huck Finn. He leaves these, you know, he's an orphan boy. His flight down the Mississippi River is the quintessential American journey. He's sitting with Nigger Jim, right? Jim is sitting with him. He calls him Nigger Jim on the raft. It's a story of racism in America and all the complications of race. It's a story of, it's got everything in it, American nature writing, American spirituality, but mainly it's got the American language. Mark Twain kind of invented the American language with this very frisky vernacular, right? It's a marvelous linguistic medium. You read Huckleberry Finn, you're just like you've jumped into the Mississippi itself, and you're just carried along by this rushing current of words. It's an amazing thing to read. You know, the whole theme of lighting out for the territory is very American. The search for the promised land. Interestingly enough, I came up with the title because in every single one of these books I'm talking about, I came across the phrase promised land. America seen as a promised land. It goes back to the old story of the Hebrew tribes wandering out of Egypt, right? Moses stands up and sees the promised land in the distance. It's always a dream in the distance, never quite realized. It's about hope. It's not about actuality. So it's a very strange myth. I see certainly Twain uses the phrase promised land, and Huck is lighting out for the territory. And then I moved on. I said, okay, let's get up into the 20th century here. And we begin the 20th century. I was trying to think, what would be the two books in the beginning of the 20th century that shaped our ideas? And I thought the first two things, Up From Slavery, Booker T. Washington, and W.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk. Those are two books written very much in tandem, in dialogue. Du Bois is writing in dialogue with Booker T. Washington. And I focused on Du Bois, but I also talk endlessly about the book he's writing in reaction to, Up From Slavery. Essentially, the terms of 20th century and 21st century race relations are framed in those books. We haven't really moved beyond the way race is framed in those books. So that's a long story. You could read my book and see what I'm talking about here. Essentially, Du Bois begins his first line. The problem of the 20th century is the color line. And it's true. This is the problem of the 20th century. The color line has been hugely difficult, right, leading up to the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s, leading finally up to Barack Obama being elected to the presidency. It's an ongoing problem, dialogue that we are grappling with as a nation. The fact that we at a certain point, I mean, it's very interesting, our relations of white Europeans with Native Americans and with African Americans. Well, the Native Americans were already here when we came. We just sort of eradicated them. It's really a case of genocide when you come right down to it. It's really a sad story, rather horrifying to contemplate. If you've ever read Toni Morrison's great novel, what's it called again? What's it called again? That's right. Well, she dedicates the book to the 60 million who died. And the 60 million were the estimate of how many people died in slavery. African Americans, 60 million of them died in slavery. That's a lot of people, 60 million. Think about that number. It's a terrible story. People wrenched from their homes in Africa, taken on slave ships and so forth. So Du Bois, who came from nowhere, of course, but in an oddly, born in western Massachusetts, raised in Great Barrington, and went to a black college. He couldn't get into Harvard because they wouldn't let a black person in, although he finally was able to transfer. They let him in, so he became the first black graduate of Harvard. And he was a brilliant mind, PhD, wrote many, many books, one of the great primary intellectuals of our history, and great sociologist, great writer, a great thinker, and an inspiring creature. And boy, when I read The Souls of Black Folk, I had sort of read in and out of it before. I was powerfully overtaken by the arguments in that book. And it seemed, and on every page, I felt it was so relevant to the whole age of Obama. Really quite interesting how many of these issues, and we're still grappling with race in this country. We're hardly there yet. It's an ongoing dilemma that we're trying to work out, how the races can get along. What is the responsibility of a person today for slavery? To what degree does the legacy of slavery still impinge on us? And all these just endless, interesting, and powerful questions. Then I went on to Mary Anton's Promised Land. It gave me the title for sure. That's an immigrant memoir. Mary Anton was a young Jewish girl from the Pale of Settlement in Russia. And then she immigrated to America at the end of the 19th century, which is the great wave of immigration. This whole chapter gave me a chance to talk about immigration patterns in America. We all know these patterns. My own family came from Italy. So I had these visions of, I knew the immigrant story from my grandmother when I was a little kid. She used to say that she was sitting in Italy, totally impoverished. She dreamed of going to this promised land of America. She made the journey on the ship. People died on the ship. She told me about them throwing bodies, burying them over the side of the ship, getting to Ellis Island, getting to America, going through the process of immigration, thinking the streets are paved with gold, and you're thrown into Little Italy, and you're going through poverty again, and you're rising up, and it's only over generations that you really are finally able to pull yourself as a family together. But it was a terribly harsh journey, a journey often of great disappointment and great fortitude. It's a tremendously fascinating story. And Mary Anton essentially established this pattern for the immigration tale with her book, which was a huge bestseller, one of the best-selling books in America between its publication in 1912 and say 1930. I think it was a bestseller for all those years. It's still a hugely influential book, Mary Anton, Promised Land, The Promised Land. She's a beautiful writer. And she wrote one other little book about immigration, and then that's it. She never wrote anything else, but her legacy is permanently imprinted here with this book. Jump ahead really fast because I want to start getting into a dialogue with you. In fact, I'll just mention some of the other books. Two of the funniest books I did really were, I decided to go way off the beaten track here. The next book I write about is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I had a great time with that, and I show how that book goes back to Ben Franklin, really. A lot of it comes out of Ben Franklin. And this was a hugely influential book, sold 15 million copies in the 30s, in the midst of the Depression. Dale Carnegie told people how to get along with your colleagues, how to get ahead in your business, how to succeed, how to make friends, how you can, as an individual, pull yourself up. And it remained. Interestingly enough, a friend of mine in England showed me in a book a little statement, which I put in my book, saying that Dale Carnegie's book has gone through 18 editions in Russia alone after Glasnost. So it's proven a worldwide success, and it continues to be influential in countries. another book I do. Then I go on from there to do Dr. Spocks' Book of Baby and Child Care. Many people were shocked that I would do that, but these are influential, epoch-changing books. I remember my mother always had Dr. Spock on the bed table, right? And I've raised 3 kids, and it's still there on my bed table. It's right there next to my bed, Dr. Spock's Book of Baby and Child Care. I hate to tell you how many times I've gone to it in my life. It really, and I love the opening of that. The first line was revolutionary. The very first words of Dr. Spock's original edition. One thing I did was go through all the different editions and trace the changes from 1946 to the present. It's gone through endless editions. And he was constantly changing things, right? You read the 1946 version, and he's telling you to give your kids castor oil and all kinds of weird things that we would never think of nowadays. But the first line is still relevant, and they've never changed it. You know more than you think you know. And it's trusting parents to have some gut sense of how to raise a child. And it's fascinating, and we do. We know more than we think we know. I mean, anytime I would think that this is an impossible task, raising children, I think, well, zillions of people have done it, so it must be doable. We all get there somehow, right? Somehow. So it was great fun working on that book. I had a wonderful time going through Dr. Spock and talking about it. And also, he was a hero of mine. He went to jail in the 60s, for his opponents. He was an anti-nuclear war campaigner, one of the first ones. He was, a civil rights campaigner, and then a great hero during the Vietnam War in opposing the war. He went to jail over and again. He was a truly great American. You're not really a great American until they put you in jail. That's what it takes in this country to get any real distinction. And then I end with 2 books. I end with Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road, which kind of invents the buddy story in America. It's a kind of comes out of the Grapes of Wrath in some ways. It's the westward journey, letting out for the territory. It's the founder of the county. He's one of the founders of the countercultural movement. Gave me a chance to talk about the various traditions and counter-traditions in American social life. And then I end with Betty Friedan, the feminist mystique, the second wave of feminism. The first wave is the suffragettes, right? It's hard to believe that, when my mother was born, she's still alive, when she was born in 1917, it was still quite a ways before women would even have the right to vote in America. Even have the right to vote as a woman. Not till 1920. And people thought, well, once you've got the right to vote, that's it. It's all set. Women are great. No problem. I had a student in Middlebury College last week. A woman said, oh, well, we don't have to have any feminism anymore. That's over with. And I said, really? You think it's over with? She said, yep, we're totally equal now. I said, really? I said, well, I'm relieved. I said, I'm glad to hear that. And I happen to have a Forbes magazine on my desk, and I said, oh, look at this. This is the Forbes 500 magazines. I was just reading that of the 500 top corporations in America, there are only 3 women who are CEOs. And I said, oops, there's the Norton Anthology of Poetry that I used in college. Let's just pluck this off the shelf, the one I used in college. There's 3,000 pages of English poetry, and not one woman is in that anthology. I said, what is it with you girls? You can't write poetry? From Homer to the present? Why were there no women who could write poetry? Are they just dumb? Oh, we've just got a new woman on the Supreme Court. That makes how many? On and on and on. How many women are presidents of universities? I happened to note, as I note in my chapter on on Betty Friedan, I went through many years of college for undergraduate years. I got a master's degree. I got a PhD. I've actually got 3 doctorates or 4 doctorates. I can't remember. And I've got more degrees than the thermometer. But I told this girl, I said, I never had one college professor who was a woman. Not one. In all my years in college and university graduate school, I never had a single female teacher. I said, so just think about, to what degree you think feminism is over with and there's nothing to be done. I think it will be done when, women have a genuinely equal access to all professions, to when children equally depend on their father and their mother for their basic needs, when husbands really do feel obliged, just as the wife, to do some shopping and cooking and clean the toilets. I mean, a lot of women today have a double life where they actually have to work full-time and do all the shopping and cooking and clean the house. That's the true story of feminism. There's a long way to go, and Betty Friedan is, part of the second stage of feminism. We're now in what they call the third stage. So it's a very complicated, it's an interesting story. Again, all of these stories are about different groups struggling for power, different groups struggling for identity, different groups struggling to see who they are, how they are, what they are, and what their dreams are, and how do they define their dreams for themselves down the road and their children. So, I mean, Promised Land struck me as the ideal title for this book. These are all authors and many, many books swirling around them, all of them trying to create a sense of an American identity. And I think that these authors are great authors, and they all do. And 100 books in my appendix all do the same thing, as do another 200 or 300 or 400 books that one couldn't even begin to mention. I mean, we are a people of the book, and we've been shaped by this language, and it's an ongoing story. That's the great news and the scary news. Well, thank you very much.